The ship called UES Valkyrie was dying, and everyone on board knew it. Smoke drifted through the broken hallways in slow, lazy curls. The lights flickered red, then dark, then red again. Somewhere deep in the hull, metal groaned like an old man standing up after a long sleep. The Valkyrie had been built to fight, built to survive, but nothing survives forever, and tonight, the ship was close to the end. Captain Elena Reyes stood on the bridge with blood on her sleeve. It was not her blood. She had already checked. Around her, the bridge crew worked in silence, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been said. The main screen showed a field of drifting debris, the remains of 6 other ships that used to belong to the Valkyrie's small patrol group. Now there was only one ship left, and it was barely a ship at all. "Report," Elena said. Her voice was steady, even though her hands were not. "Hull integrity at 31%, said Lieutenant Marcus Cole, the ship's executive officer. He did not look up from his console. "Reactor 2 is offline. Reactor 1 is holding, but barely. We lost weapons control on the port side 20 minutes ago. Life support is stable for now, but if we take one more hit like the last one, we lose that too." "And the enemy?" "Gone," Marcus said. "For now. They think we're finished. They're not wrong." Elena walked closer to the main screen and looked at the wreckage of her fleet. She had known every captain out there. She had eaten dinner with them, laughed with them, argued with them about nothing important. Now they were gone, turned into scattered metal floating in the dark, and she was still alive, and she did not understand why. 3 days ago, none of this was supposed to happen. The Valkyrie and its small fleet had been sent to the edge of known space, past the last human colony, to check on a strange signal picked up by a listening station. It was routine work. Boring work even. Humanity had been part of the wider galaxy for almost 40 years now, ever since the first contact with the Dravine Assembly, a huge alliance of alien species that ran most of known space. Humans were still new, still small, still, in the eyes of most of the galaxy, unimportant. That was supposed to be a good thing. Unimportant species did not get attacked. Unimportant species were left alone, to grow, to learn, to slowly join the larger community of stars. That was the theory, anyway. The theory turned out to be wrong. The attackers had come out of nowhere, using a type of stealth technology that human sensors could not detect, until it was far too late. Their ships were sleek and dark, shaped like the fins of some deep-sea fish, and they did not send any warning, did not ask for surrender, did not offer any of the diplomatic messages that were supposed to come before a fight in this part of the galaxy. They simply opened fire. Elena still remembered the first few seconds of the battle, the flash of light on the sensor screen, the scream of an ensign whose station had exploded before she could even understand what was happening, the sick feeling in her stomach as she watched 2 of her ships die in less than a minute. She had given the order to fall back, to run, but running had not been enough. The enemy ships were faster. One by one, her small fleet had been picked apart, until only the Valkyrie remained, alone, wounded, and far from any help. "Captain," said a voice from the communication station. It was Ensign Priya Anand, young, barely 2 years out of the academy, her face pale, but her voice trying to sound calm. "I've been picking up fragments of their communications. I don't understand their language, but the translation software is starting to make sense of some of it. I think they're calling themselves the Threshy." "Threshy," Elena repeated. She had never heard the name before. That was not surprising. The galaxy was enormous, and humanity had barely explored a corner of it. There could be 1,000 species out there that no human had ever heard of. "They said something else," Priya continued, hesitating. "The translation isn't perfect, but I think they said, a test. This was a test." Marcus turned in his chair, his face hard. "A test? They killed 6 ships and hundreds of people to run a test?" "I don't know, sir," Priya said. "That's just what the words seem to mean. Maybe they wanted to see how humans fight. Maybe they wanted to see how strong we are, before deciding whether we're worth taking seriously." Elena felt something cold settle in her chest. If that was true, then this was not really about the Valkyrie, or her lost ships at all. This was about humanity as a whole. Some alien power out here, one that human diplomats had never even met, had decided to test the newest species in the galactic community, the way someone might poke a strange animal with a stick to see if it bites. And humanity had just shown them exactly how hard it could bite, just not hard enough to win. "Ma'am," said the ship's chief engineer, Tomas Vega, stepping onto the bridge with grease on his hands and exhaustion on his face. "I've got good news and bad news." "Give me the bad news first," Elena said. "I'm tired of waiting for it." "The bad news is, Reactor 1 is going to fail within 12 hours, maybe less, if we keep running life support and weapons at the same time. We don't have the parts to fix Reactor 2. Not out here." "And the good news?" "The good news is the long-range communication array survived. Barely. It's held together with prayer and duct tape, but it works. We can send a message." Elena felt a small, fragile spark of hope. "Then send it. Send everything. Send an SOS on every channel we have, human and alien both. Tell them who we are, where we are, and what happened." "Captain," Marcus said quietly, "you know how far we are from home. Even if someone hears the signal, help could be weeks away. Reactor 1 won't last that long. Neither will we, if the Threshi come back." "I know," Elena said, "but an SOS costs us nothing to send, and it might save someone else's life even if it can't save ours. Someone needs to know what's out here. Someone needs to know what the Threshi did, and what they're capable of." She turned to Priya. "Ensign, prepare the signal. Full data package. Sensor logs, the wreckage of our fleet. Everything we picked up about the Threshi ships and their weapons. If we don't survive this, at least the truth will." Priya's hands moved quickly over her console, gathering the data, compressing it, preparing the burst transmission that would carry Valkyrie's story out into the dark. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her focus did not waver. "Ready, Captain." "Send it." The signal left the ship in a single bright pulse, invisible to the human eye, racing outward, at the speed of light, in every direction the Valkyrie's damaged array could reach. It was a simple message, really. A ship in distress, a crew asking for help. But buried inside it was something much larger, proof that a new player had entered the great game of the galaxy, and that this new player had already made an enemy. None of the crew on the Valkyrie's bridge could have guessed just how far that signal would travel, or who would be listening when it arrived. Far away, on a listening post built into a hollowed-out asteroid near the edge of Threshi territory, an operator named Ketsaral sat up straight in his seat as an old, half-forgotten alert chimed on his console. It was a signal type he had not seen active in years. A general distress call, broadcast wide and loud, using a communication protocol that had been quietly filed away in the Threshi archives as belonging to a species called humans. Ketsaral was not a soldier. He was barely more than a technician, someone who spent his long shifts watching for signals that almost never came. But he knew enough history to understand what he was looking at. Humans were the newest species to join the wider galactic community, small and unproven, tucked away in a corner of space that most of the older powers considered unimportant. Unimportant, except for one thing. A raiding fleet under Commander Threl Vashan had been sent out 3 days ago to test exactly this species, to see if the stories about human ships were true or simply the boasting of a young, foolish civilization. Ketsaral had heard whispers about the mission. Everyone on the station had. It was supposed to be quick and quiet, a demonstration of Threshi's superiority against a fleet that was, by every measurement the Threshi possessed, weaker in every way. And now here was a signal, broadcast from the exact region where that raiding fleet had been sent, calling for help in a language the archives recognized instantly. Ketsaral's job was simple. Watch, listen, report anything unusual. This was about as unusual as it got. He forwarded the signal up the chain of command with a short note attached, his fingers moving quickly over the console. Human distress signal detected. Location matches Commander Threl Vashan's operational area. Recommend immediate review. He leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. Somewhere out there, humans were calling for help, and Ketsaral had a strange, uneasy feeling that this signal was not the end of something. It felt more like the beginning. He did not know it yet, but he was right. Back on the Valkyrie, the crew worked through what remained of their ship's systems with grim determination. Tomas Vega and his small team crawled through access tunnels barely wide enough for a human body, patching leaks, rerouting power, doing everything they could to squeeze a few more hours of life out of a hull that had already given far more than it was designed to give. Marcus Cole moved from station to station, checking on the crew, offering quiet words of encouragement where he could, because morale mattered just as much as hull integrity when a ship was this close to the edge. Elena Reyes stayed on the bridge, watching the main screen, watching the empty space where her fleet used to be. She thought about the families waiting back home, the ones who did not yet know that their loved ones were gone. She thought about the Threshi, and their strange test, and what it meant that an alien power had decided humanity was worth attacking, rather than worth talking to. She did not know that far behind the Threshi lines, a nervous technician had just sent a warning up the chain of command. She did not know that somewhere much closer to human space, automated relay stations were already picking up fragments of her SOS and passing them along, station to station, toward Earth, and toward every human military outpost along the frontier. She did not know that humanity's response to a call like this one was not what most of the galaxy expected. All she knew was that her ship was dying, her crew was frightened, and somewhere out there, an enemy that thought it had already won was circling back to finish the job. "Captain," Priya said suddenly, her voice tight. "New contact, multiple contacts, they're coming back." Elena's jaw tightened. She looked at the screen, at the small cluster of icons appearing at the edge of their sensor range, and she felt the same cold certainty she had felt 3 days ago, right before the first shots were fired. "All hands," she said, her voice carrying through the ship's remaining intercom system. "Brace for contact. This isn't over yet." Somewhere in the dark, the Threshi ships turned their sensors toward the crippled human vessel, confident that this time, there would be no long fight, no unexpected losses, no surprises. The Valkyrie was wounded prey, and wounded prey did not usually put up much of a fight. They had no idea what they were about to walk into, and they had even less idea about what their own test had already set in motion, far beyond the reach of their sensors, in places they had never even thought to look. The SOS was already out, and humanity was already answering. Commander Threl Vashon stood on the command deck of his flagship, the Silent Current, and watched the wounded human ship on his tactical display, with something close to disappointment. He had expected more of a fight. 3 days ago, when his small raiding fleet had ambushed the human patrol group, he had gone in expecting resistance, expecting the humans to fight back with the strange, aggressive tactics his intelligence reports had described. Instead, the humans had done what most young species did when faced with superior firepower. They had tried to run. They had died anyway, one ship at a time, until only this single crippled vessel remained, drifting and broken at the edge of a debris field made of its own dead fleet. It should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt hollow, almost boring. "Commander," said his second-in-command, an officer named Vesic, "the human ship is still transmitting. Some kind of distress signal, wide broadcast, very inefficient. It will not reach any help in time. Should we jam it?" Threl Vashon considered this for a moment. Jamming the signal would take resources, and resources were not something he liked to waste on a target that was already finished. "Let them scream into the dark," he said. "It changes nothing. There is no one close enough to hear them, and even if there were, we will finish this before anyone can respond." He had been sent here by the Threshi High Council to answer a simple question. Were humans as dangerous as the rumors suggested, or were they simply another young species that had gotten lucky in a few isolated encounters? The Council had heard stories, second-hand accounts passed along from smaller powers who had brief, strange dealings with humanity. Stories of humans fighting with a kind of desperate, reckless courage that unsettled even experienced observers. Stories of a species that seemed to grow stronger and more organized the more it was threatened, rather than weaker. Threl Vashon had considered these stories exaggerated. Every young species had its legends, its tales of heroism meant to make itself feel important in a galaxy full of older, more powerful civilizations. He had come here expecting to prove that humans were nothing special, and so far, the evidence supported him completely. 6 human ships destroyed. 1 left crippled and helpless. No unusual tactics, no secret weapons, no sign of the fearsome resistance the rumors had promised. "Finish them," Threl Vashon ordered. "No prisoners are required this time. Simply confirm the kill, and record everything for the Council's review." The Threshi fleet, 5 sleek raiding ships shaped like the fins of some ancient predator, began to close in on the drifting Valkyrie. Aboard the human ship, Elena Reyes watched the approaching enemy contacts with a strange, tired calm. She had already accepted, somewhere in the back of her mind, that this might be the end. But acceptance did not mean surrender. Options, she said to her bridge crew. Not many, Marcus admitted. Weapons are down to the forward battery only. We've got maybe 6 shots left before the capacitors give out completely. Shields are patchy at best. If they come in with all 5 ships firing together, we won't last more than a minute or 2. Then we make that minute count, Elena said. Thomas, how much power can you squeeze out of Reactor 1 before it fails completely? Thomas Vega's voice came through the intercom, strained but steady. If I push it past safety limits, I can give you a big power spike, maybe enough for 1 strong shot, or a shield boost, but it'll probably fry the reactor for good afterward. We won't get a second chance at it. Understood, Elena said. Stand by. I want that spike ready the moment I give the order, not a second before. She looked at the tactical display, watching the 5 Threshy ships spread out into an attack formation around her lone, wounded vessel. It was the kind of formation designed to overwhelm, to make sure that no matter which direction the target tried to run, there would be no escape. Elena had spent years studying old Earth military history, back before the stars, back when humans only fought each other instead of aliens from beyond the sky. She remembered lessons about desperate last stands, about the strange, stubborn refusal of cornered animals and cornered people to simply lie down and die. Humans, it turned out, were very good at refusing to die quietly. It was, in its own strange way, one of the most consistent facts about human history. They think this is already over, Marcus said quietly, watching the enemy ships close in with an almost lazy confidence. Let them think that, Elena said. It might be the only advantage we have left. Far behind the front lines of this small, brutal skirmish, humanity's response to the SOS was already gathering speed, moving through channels that neither Elena Reyes nor Commander Threl Vashon yet understood. At Fortress Meridian, a heavily fortified human deep space station, built at the edge of explored territory, an alarm had gone off in the middle of the night shift. Fortress Meridian existed for exactly one reason: to listen, to watch, and to react the instant something happened along the frontier. It was staffed by a small, permanent garrison, and it was connected, through a chain of relay buoys, to almost every human military asset within 100 light-years. Admiral Grace Okonkwo had been asleep when the alarm sounded. She was awake, and in the command center within 4 minutes, still pulling on her uniform jacket as she scanned the incoming data. Talk to me, she said to the duty officer. Ma'am, we picked up a distress signal about 6 hours ago, still analyzing the full data package, but the short version is bad. It's from the Valkyrie, part of Captain Reyes's patrol group. The signal reports contact with an unknown hostile force. Multiple ships lost. The Valkyrie itself is severely damaged and adrift. Grace felt her stomach tighten. She had known Elena Reyes for almost 15 years. They had come up through the academy together, back before either of them had ever imagined serving on ships that traveled between stars. Location? The duty officer pulled up a star chart, and Grace's frown deepened as she studied it. It was far, dangerously far, well past the edge of regular patrol routes, in a region of space that human maps still labeled mostly as unexplored. That's outside our normal response range, the duty officer said carefully. Even our fastest ships would take days to get there. I know where it is, Lieutenant, Grace said. I'm asking you to tell me what we have that can move fast. There was a pause. Ma'am, there's Task Force Ember. They've been running exercises in the outer sectors, closer to that region than any of our other assets. If we redirect them immediately, they could reach the Valkyrie's last known position in approximately 18 hours. Grace did not hesitate. Redirect them. Full priority override. I want every ship in that task force moving the moment this call ends. Ma'am, Task Force Ember is not exactly a small deployment. Are you sure you want to commit that much force to a single distress call? Grace looked at the star chart, at the small blinking icon that represented the last known position of the Valkyrie, and thought about Elena Reyes's face the last time they had spoken, sharing coffee and old jokes before Elena had shipped out on this assignment. Lieutenant, Grace said quietly, one of our ships sent an SOS. That means, somewhere out there, human sailors are in trouble, and they are asking for help. We do not sit here calculating whether they are worth saving. We simply go. It was a simple philosophy, and it was one that had been baked into human military doctrine since long before humanity had ever left its home solar system. An SOS was not a request to be weighed against cost and convenience. It was an obligation, absolute and unquestioned. Whatever ships were close enough to answer, answered, and they answered with everything they had, because the alternative, leaving your own people to die alone in the dark, was simply not something humanity as a species had ever been comfortable accepting. It was a philosophy that had confused more than one alien diplomat over the years. Several species humanity had encountered in its short time among the stars operated very differently, weighing the cost of a rescue mission against strategic value, deciding sometimes that certain lives were simply not worth the resources required to save them. Humans found this idea strange and, in a quiet way, horrifying. It was one of the first cultural differences that had marked humanity as unusual in the eyes of the wider galaxy. Task Force Ember, a group of 12 human warships under the command of Captain Daniel Osei, received their new orders less than 10 minutes after Admiral Okonkwo gave the command. There was no debate, no lengthy discussion about risk versus reward. The task force simply changed course, engines burning hot as they altered their heading toward the coordinates buried in the Valkyrie's distress signal. Captain Osei stood on the bridge of his flagship, the UES Steadfast, and read through the incoming data with a grim expression. "An unknown hostile force," he murmured. "Well, that's new. First contact with a new species, and it's already trying to kill our people," said his XO, a stocky officer named Priya Nair, no relation to the young ensign serving aboard the distant Valkyrie, though the coincidence of names would later be noted with some dark humor by the crew. "Wonderful first impression." "They don't know it yet," Osei said, "but they've made a mistake that's going to be very expensive for them." He was not simply speaking out of anger or bravado, he was speaking from experience. In humanity's short time among the stars, this was not the first time some ambitious alien power had decided to test the newcomers with force instead of diplomacy. It had happened twice before, in smaller, more contained incidents along different sections of the frontier. Both times, the results had been the same: overwhelming, decisive human retaliation, followed by a quick and permanent change in how that particular alien power treated humanity afterward. Word of those incidents had not spread very far, mostly because the powers involved had strong incentives to keep their embarrassing defeats quiet. But within certain corners of galactic military and diplomatic circles, a quiet reputation was beginning to form, a reputation that most humans were not even aware existed. Humans, the whispers said, did not respond to aggression the way older, more cautious species did. They did not calculate acceptable losses or weigh political costs before deciding to fight back. When threatened, they simply came, and they came with everything they had, and they kept coming, until the threat was gone. Task Force Ember burned across the dark at speeds that strained the limits of their engines, racing toward a battle that had, unknown to them, already begun without them. Back aboard the Valkyrie, the 5 Threshy ships closed the final distance, weapons charging, confident in a victory that had already been decided in their minds. Elena Reyes stood on her bridge, watching them come, one hand resting on the arm of her command chair, the other hovering near the console that would trigger Tomas Vega's desperate power spike. "Steady," she said to her crew, though the word was as much for herself as for them. "Steady. Let them get close. Let them think we're finished." The Threshy opened fire. The first volley of Threshy fire lit up the dark like a string of angry fireworks, and the Valkyrie shuddered as several bolts struck her already weakened shields. "Shields at 18%, Marcus called out, gripping the edge of his console as the ship rocked beneath him. "They're not even using their full firepower. They're toying with us." "Let them," Elena said through gritted teeth. "Thomas, status on that power spike?" "Ready whenever you say the word, Captain," Tomas answered, his voice tight with strain. "But once I fire it, that's it. Reactor 1 is done, after this." Elena watched the tactical display as the 5 Threshy ships spread into a wide circle around the Valkyrie, clearly enjoying themselves, clearly certain that this fight was already decided. It was exactly the kind of overconfidence she had been hoping for. "Priya," she said, "how confident are you in that partial translation of their tactical channel?" "Maybe 60%, Captain, but it's improving fast." Whatever they're saying to each other, it sounds like bragging. I think they're recording this for some kind of report. Elena allowed herself a thin, humorless smile. Good. Let them record it. She turned to Marcus. Concentrate everything we have left on the ship, marked as their command vessel. If Priya's translation is right, that's the silent current, the one giving the orders. That's their most heavily shielded ship, Captain, Marcus said. If we're going to gamble everything on one shot, shouldn't we pick an easier target? No, Elena said firmly. If we're going down, we're going to make sure the one in charge remembers exactly who they were fighting. Tomas, give me that power spike, now. Deep in the ship's damaged engineering section, Tomas Vega slammed his hand down on a manual override, forcing Reactor 1 far beyond its safety limits. Warning lights flashed red across every panel in the room, and the reactor let out a high, screaming whine that every crew member on board could feel through the deck plating. On the bridge, the forward weapon battery, drained and useless only moments before, suddenly surged with raw, unstable power. A single massive beam of energy tore out from the Valkyrie's hull, brighter and hotter than anything the ship's design specifications ever intended it to produce, and slammed directly into the shields of the silent current. For a moment, everything on the Threshy flagship's bridge went white. Commander Threl Vashon was thrown from his command chair as alarms screamed around him. Report, he barked, pulling himself upright, his composure cracking, for the first time since the engagement began. Shields down to 11%, Vesic shouted, staring at his console in disbelief. That should not have been possible. Their weapons were nearly depleted. Apparently not depleted enough, Threl Vashon growled, staring at the tactical display in shock. The wounded human ship, the one he had already mentally filed away as destroyed, had just nearly crippled his flagship with a single desperate shot. Aboard the Valkyrie, the massive power surge that had fired the shot immediately overloaded the ship's already damaged systems. Reactor 1, pushed far beyond its limits, shuddered violently, and then went dark completely, plunging half the ship into emergency lighting and silence. Reactor 1 is gone, Tomas reported grimly. We're running on backup power only. Life support is stable, but we've got no weapons, minimal shields, and no way to maneuver, except thrusters. It was worth it, Elena said, watching the tactical display as the silent current's shields flickered dangerously low. Look at them. They're not laughing anymore. On the Threshy flagship, Threl Vashon stared at the crippled human vessel, with a mixture of anger and something new, something he had not expected to feel in this engagement. Caution. That was not luck, he said quietly. That was a calculated risk. They knew exactly what they were doing. Commander, Vesic said, our shields will regenerate within a few minutes. The human ship has no weapons left. We can still finish this easily. Threl Vashon considered this. Vesic was right, of course. The Valkyrie posed no further threat, not really. One lucky shot did not change the overall outcome of this battle. But something about the encounter had unsettled him, a small crack in the certainty he had carried since this mission began. Finish it, he ordered finally. But do not underestimate them again. Whatever else is true about these humans, they do not fight like a species that expects to lose. The Threshy ships began to reposition, preparing for a final, overwhelming strike against the now completely defenseless Valkyrie. On the human ship's bridge, Elena Reyes watched them regroup with a strange sense of calm settling over her. She had done what she could. She had bought her crew a little more time, forced her enemy to respect her ship even in its final moments, and sent a message out into the dark that might, someday, save someone else's life, even if it could not save her own. All hands, she said quietly over the intercom. I want to say something, and I want everyone to hear it, no matter where you are on this ship. We fought as hard as we could. We hurt them. We made them remember our name. Whatever happens next, I am proud of every single one of you. There was a heavy silence on the bridge as her words settled over the crew. Captain, Priya said suddenly, her voice cracking with something that was not despair. New contact. Multiple new contacts, approaching from the far side of the debris field, moving fast. Elena's head snapped up. Identify. Priya's hands flew across her console, and for a moment, nobody on the bridge breathed. Then her face broke into something between shock and disbelief. IFF signatures confirmed, Captain. They're ours. It's Task Force Ember. 12 ships. They're coming in hot." For a moment, nobody on the bridge said anything at all. Then Marcus let out a short, broken laugh, half relief and half disbelief. 18 hours, he said. "They said it would take at least 18 hours to reach us. It's barely been 14. They pushed their engines past safety limits to get here faster," Elena said, staring at the tactical display, at the 12 friendly icons now streaking toward the battle, at speeds that should not have been possible for standard human warships. Of course they did. On the Threshy flagship, alarms began blaring in a different tone entirely, as sensor operators scrambled to make sense of the new contacts appearing on their screens. "Commander," Vesic shouted, 12 unknown vessels approaching at extreme velocity. Configuration matches the same species as the target vessel." Threl Vashon stared at the display, his earlier confidence draining away completely. Impossible. There was no indication of any human presence within days of this position. "They must have responded to the distress signal," Vesic said, his voice tightening with something close to alarm. "But the timing, they would have needed to be already close, already moving, before we even completed our first assault on the original fleet." Threl Vashon understood immediately what that meant, and the understanding chilled him in a way that direct combat rarely did. It meant that somewhere in human military doctrine, there existed some kind of standing protocol, some pre-positioned response force, ready to move the instant an SOS was detected, regardless of distance, regardless of risk, regardless of the odds. It meant that humans did not simply react to danger. They prepared for it, constantly, as a matter of course, treating every distress signal as an absolute obligation, rather than a request to be weighed and measured. "New orders," Threl Vashon said, his voice tight. "All ships, prepare for immediate combat footing. We will not underestimate this enemy a second time." But even as he gave the order, he understood, deep down, that his fleet's advantage had already evaporated. 5 raiding ships, however capable, were not designed to fight 12 full warships arriving at combat speed with clear intent, and, judging by the aggressive vector of their approach, very little interest in negotiation. Aboard the Valkyrie, Elena Reyes watched Task Force Ember close the distance with a fierce, exhausted kind of pride swelling in her chest. "Priya," she said, "open a channel to Captain Osei. Tell him it's good to see a friendly face." The Threshy commander's earlier confidence, the lazy certainty that had marked the beginning of this engagement, was gone completely now, replaced by the growing, uneasy realization that his simple test of a supposedly weak new species had somehow spiraled into something far larger and far more dangerous than anything the Threshy High Council had anticipated. The galaxy, it seemed, was about to learn a great deal more about humanity than the Threshy had originally intended to teach it. Captain Daniel Osei watched the wreckage of the human patrol fleet scroll past on his main screen, and something cold and hard settled behind his eyes. "Confirm target lock on all 5 hostile vessels," he said, his voice flat and controlled. "Do not fire until we're in effective range. I want this done properly, not messily." "Aye, Captain," said his weapons officer, a young lieutenant named Sarah Kimura, her hands steady on her console despite the tension in the room. Task Force Ember spread out as it approached the battle zone, 12 ships moving with the practiced precision of a force that trained constantly for exactly this kind of engagement. Unlike the 5 Threshy raiders, who had been built and equipped for quick, one-sided ambushes against weaker targets, the ships of Task Force Ember were designed for sustained combat against serious opposition. They were slower to provoke, but far harder to stop once provoked. On the silent current, Commander Threl Vashon watched the approaching human fleet with a growing sense of dread that he did his best to hide from his crew. "Options," he said to Vesic, though he already suspected there were not many good ones left. "We could attempt to retreat," Vesic said carefully. "Our ships are faster than theirs in a straight line. We could disengage and return to report our findings to the Council. And leave the wounded human ship intact, along with everything we've just demonstrated about our own capabilities and weaknesses." Threl Vashon shook his head slowly. "No. If we run now, we confirm every unflattering rumor about Threshy cowardice that our rivals have been spreading for years. We fight, and we make them pay a price for this, even if we cannot win outright." It was, in its own way, a decision built on pride rather than strategy, and it would prove to be a costly one. The two fleets closed the remaining distance in tense, grim silence. Then, without any further warning, the battle resumed, this time on vastly different terms than before. Task Force Ember opened fire first, 12 ships, unleashing coordinated volleys, with a precision that came from years of joint training exercises. The 5 Threshy Raiders, still recovering their shields from the earlier engagement with the Valkyrie, found themselves suddenly on the defensive, against an enemy far more numerous and far better organized than the crippled ship they had expected to simply finish off. "Concentrate fire on the lead vessel," Osei ordered, watching as the Threshy ships scattered, trying desperately to break the coordinated attack pattern being used against them. "Kimura, target their shield generators. Let's see how well their engineering holds up under pressure." The battle that followed was fast, brutal, and almost entirely one-sided. The Threshy Raiders, built for speed and stealth rather than prolonged combat, found their advantages meant very little against a force that refused to be surprised, refused to be intimidated, and refused to give ground even when taking heavy fire. One of the Threshy ships, attempting a sharp evasive maneuver, misjudged its distance from a nearby piece of debris left over from the earlier destruction of the original human patrol group. The resulting collision tore a massive gash along its hull, and the ship spun away from the battle, venting atmosphere and losing power rapidly. "One down," Kimura reported, a note of grim satisfaction in her voice. Aboard the Valkyrie, Elena Reyes watched the battle unfold on what remained of her ship's sensors, feeling a strange, complicated mixture of relief and lingering fear. Her ship could do nothing more to help, drifting powerless amid the wreckage, but she found herself unable to look away from the fight happening just beyond her damaged hull. "They're winning," Marcus said quietly, standing beside her, watching the same display. "They're not just winning," Elena said. "They're making a point." She was right. Captain Osei was not simply trying to defeat the Threshy Raiders. He was making absolutely certain that whatever survivors escaped this battle would carry back an unmistakable message to whoever had sent them. Task Force Ember fought with a controlled, methodical intensity that left no room for the Threshy to regroup, adapt, or find any weakness to exploit. On the silent current, Threl Vashon watched his small fleet being systematically dismantled with a growing sense of horror. This was not the disorganized, desperate defense he had expected from a wounded and outnumbered opponent. This was a coordinated, disciplined assault, carried out by an enemy that seemed to have anticipated every move he might make before he made it. "Shields at 30% and falling," Vesic reported, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "2 more of our ships have taken critical damage. Commander, if we do not retreat now, we may not survive this engagement at all." Threl Vashon stared at the tactical display, watching his carefully planned test of humanity collapse into a humiliating defeat right before his eyes. Pride had brought him this far, but pride alone would not save what remained of his fleet. "All ships, disengage," he ordered finally, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "Full retreat. Return to Threshy territory immediately." But even as the order went out, Captain Osei was already anticipating exactly this response. "They're trying to run," Osei said, watching the remaining Threshy ships attempt to break away from the engagement. "Kimura, target their engines. I want at least one of those ships disabled and captured intact. The council back home is going to want answers, and I intend to make sure we have something more solid than sensor logs to give them." The remaining Threshy ships scattered in different directions, desperate to escape the engagement zone before Task Force Ember could bring its full firepower to bear again. Most of them succeeded, their superior speed finally proving useful in retreat, if not in battle. But the silent current itself, weighed down by damaged systems and a crew struggling to manage multiple critical failures at once, could not outrun the pursuit. "Their flagship is losing power to its main engines," Kimura reported. "We can catch them, Captain." "Do it," Osei said, "but hold fire unless they resist. I want that ship taken mostly intact if at all possible." Aboard the silent current, Threl Vashon felt the ship shudder as pursuing human vessels closed the distance with terrifying speed. He understood, with a grim and complete clarity, that further resistance would accomplish nothing except getting his remaining crew killed. "Signal the human fleet," he said quietly. Tell them we surrender the ship." It was not a decision he made easily. Surrender was not something the Threshi military culture handled with much grace, and Threl Vashon understood that his career, perhaps his entire future within Threshi military service, had likely just ended in this single, disastrous engagement. But there was a difference between accepting defeat and needlessly sacrificing his crew's lives, and Threl Vashon, whatever his flaws, was not willing to cross that particular line. Task Force Ember's boarding teams moved on to the crippled Silent Current less than an hour later, securing the ship's remaining crew with efficient, professional caution. Threl Vashon himself was taken into custody without resistance, standing quietly on his own bridge as human soldiers moved past him, securing systems and gathering data with quick, practiced movements. Captain Osei arrived aboard the captured vessel personally, accompanied by a small security detail, and found the Threshi commander waiting for him with an expression that mixed defeat with something that looked almost like curiosity. "Commander Threl Vashon, I presume," Osei said, using the name that Priya Anand's improving translation software had picked up during the engagement. "You have the advantage of me," Threl Vashon replied through his own translation device, his voice carefully neutral. "I do not know your name, or the full extent of what your species is capable of. It seems my council sent me here with very incomplete information." "Captain Daniel Osei," Osei said, "and you're right about the incomplete information. Whatever you were told about humans before you attacked my people, it was wrong." Threl Vashon studied the human captain for a long moment. "May I ask a question, Captain? Purely out of professional curiosity, given that my career is very likely already finished regardless of your answer." "Ask." "Your reinforcements arrived in a fraction of the time any reasonable estimate would have predicted, given the distances involved, and they arrived not merely as a token response, but as a fully coordinated combat force, prepared for exactly the kind of engagement that followed. This suggests either extraordinary luck or some standing policy that treats every distress call as an unconditional demand for immediate, overwhelming response, regardless of distance or risk. Which is it?" Osei considered the question for a moment before answering honestly. "It's not luck, Commander. It's policy. When one of our ships calls for help, we come. Whatever the distance, whatever the cost, we come. And we come with everything we have. It's not something we debate. It's simply what we do." Threl Vashon absorbed this answer in silence, and something in his expression shifted, a kind of grim, reluctant understanding settling over his features. "That is a very unusual policy," he said finally. "Most species I am familiar with weigh such decisions carefully, balancing the value of the individuals in distress against the resources and risk required for rescue. Your species appears to have skipped that calculation entirely." "We tried it the other way, once, a long time ago," Osei said. "Back on Earth, before we ever reached the stars. It didn't go well for us. We learned some hard lessons about what happens when you leave your own people behind. We don't intend to repeat those lessons." He did not elaborate further, and Threl Vashon did not press the point, though the human captain's words lingered with him, a small piece of a much larger puzzle he was only beginning to understand about this strange young species that his council had so badly underestimated. Elsewhere on the battlefield, rescue teams from Task Force Ember had already begun transferring emergency supplies and medical personnel aboard the crippled Valkyrie, working quickly to stabilize the ship's failing systems and treat its exhausted, wounded crew. Elena Reyes stood on her own bridge, watching human rescue teams move through her ship with brisk efficiency, and allowed herself, for the first time in 3 long, brutal days, to feel something like relief. "We made it," Marcus said quietly beside her, disbelief still evident in his voice. "We made it," Elena agreed, "but this isn't over, Marcus, not by a long way. Whoever sent those raiders, whoever this Threshi council is, they're going to want to know exactly what happened here, and I have a feeling this is only the beginning of a much bigger conversation." She was right, though even she could not yet fully appreciate just how far and how fast the story of the Valkyrie's desperate stand and humanity's overwhelming response was about to spread across the wider galaxy. 3 weeks after the battle near the wreckage of her lost fleet, Elena Reyes stood in a small, quiet conference room aboard Fortress Meridian, waiting for a meeting that would decide a great deal more than she fully understood at the time. The Valkyrie itself had been towed back to human territory, her crew transferred to safer quarters while engineers debated whether the old ship was worth repairing, or better off retired with honor. Elena had visited the wreck once since returning, walking through the same corridors where she and her crew had fought for survival, and had found herself surprised by how strange it felt to see the ship silent and dark, instead of filled with the sounds of battle and desperate repair work. Admiral Grace Okonkwo entered the conference room a few minutes later, looking tired but satisfied in a way that suggested good news rather than bad. "Elena," Grace said warmly, gripping her old friend's hand, "you look better than the last report suggested you would." "I've had 3 weeks of actual sleep," Elena said. "It helps." Grace gestured for her to sit, and the two of them settled at the small conference table together. "I imagine you've heard some of what's happened since Task Force Ember brought your ship home." "Some," Elena admitted. "Rumors mostly. I heard the captured Threshy commander is being held for diplomatic questioning. I heard something about the story spreading faster than anyone expected." Grace nodded slowly. "That's the part I actually wanted to talk to you about." She activated a small display on the table between them, and an image appeared showing a complex web of connections, lines linking different points across a rough star chart. "This is a rough map of how word of the battle has traveled since it happened. It started small, just diplomatic channels between us and a few smaller powers we already had contact with, but it hasn't stayed small." Elena studied the display, watching the web of connections spread further and further outward. "How far has it gone?" "Further than we expected, and faster," Grace said. "Apparently the Threshy aren't the only ones who had doubts about humanity's capabilities. There's an entire network of smaller and mid-level powers out there who have been quietly watching us since first contact, trying to decide how seriously to take us. The story of a single crippled human ship fighting off a superior force long enough for reinforcements to arrive, and then those reinforcements systematically dismantling the attacking fleet, has apparently made quite an impression." "That wasn't the point," Elena said quietly. "We weren't trying to send a message. We were just trying to survive." "I know," Grace said, "but sometimes the two things end up looking the same from the outside." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "There's something else you should know. The captured commander, Threl Vashan, has been surprisingly cooperative during questioning. According to our diplomatic team, he's provided a great deal of useful information about the Threshy Council's internal politics, including the fact that his mission was authorized, specifically, to test our capabilities before deciding how to treat us going forward." "A test," Elena repeated, the same cold anger from 3 weeks ago flickering briefly behind her eyes. "They killed 6 of my ships and hundreds of people as a test." "I know," Grace said again, more gently this time. "And it's not something we're simply going to forgive or forget. But it's also given us an unexpected opportunity. The Threshy Council, according to Threl Vashan, is deeply divided right now. Some factions wanted this kind of aggressive testing from the beginning, others argued for caution, for diplomacy instead. The disaster at your battle has strengthened the cautious faction considerably, and weakened the aggressive one." Elena considered this for a long moment. "So what happens now?" "Now," Grace said, "diplomatic teams from both sides are trying to negotiate some kind of formal agreement, something that acknowledges what happened, without escalating things into a full-scale war neither side particularly wants. It's slow going, and it's not entirely my area of expertise, but from what I understand, the fact that we responded so quickly and so overwhelmingly to your distress call has actually made the Threshy more willing to negotiate seriously, rather than less. Because they're afraid of us now," Elena said. "Because they respect us now," Grace corrected gently. "There's a difference, even if it doesn't always feel like one. Fear alone rarely leads to lasting peace. Respect, even reluctant respect, earned through violence, sometimes does." Elena was quiet for a while, processing everything she had just heard. It was strange to think that the desperate, brutal fight for survival she had led 3 weeks ago was now being discussed in diplomatic circles across dozens of different alien governments, shaping decisions and negotiations far beyond anything she could have imagined during those long, terrifying hours aboard her dying ship. "There's one more thing," Grace said, her tone shifting slightly. "Something a little more personal, if you're interested." "Go on." "Task Force Ember's engagement, along with your own actions aboard the Valkyrie, has been formally recorded and is being reviewed for commendation. I won't pretend the details are finalized yet, but it's likely you're going to receive some fairly significant recognition once the paperwork clears. More importantly, from a practical standpoint, Fleet Command is already discussing expanded funding for exactly the kind of rapid response task forces that saved your life. Task Force Ember wasn't supposed to be a permanent fixture out there, more of an experimental deployment. After this, that's probably going to change. Elena managed a tired smile. So my ship almost got destroyed, and the result is more paperwork and more ships. Welcome to military life, Grace said, smiling back. It's rarely as glamorous as people imagine, but sometimes it actually accomplishes something worthwhile. Later that same day, in a different part of Fortress Meridian, Captain Daniel Osei sat across a small table from Commander Threl Vashon, who had requested one final conversation, before being formally transferred to a diplomatic holding facility, pending further negotiations between human and Threshi representatives. I wanted to ask you something before I'm taken elsewhere, Threl Vashon said, his translated voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity that Osei had come to recognize over their brief acquaintance. Something about your species that I still do not fully understand. Go ahead, Osei said. Your response to that distress call. I have had time to think about it further, and I remain puzzled. Even accounting for your unusual policy regarding rescue operations, the speed and scale of your reaction still seems disproportionate to any reasonable strategic calculation. You risked 12 fully equipped warships, committing them at speeds that clearly exceeded safe operational limits, to rescue a single already crippled vessel that many other species would have simply written off as an acceptable loss. That's a fair question, Osei admitted. I'm not sure I have a perfect answer for you. Part of it is policy, like I said before. Part of it, I think, is history. Humans spent a very long time fighting each other before we ever looked up at the stars. And one thing that history taught us, over and over, the hard way, is that leaving your own people behind almost always costs you more in the long run than it saves. Trust breaks, morale breaks, eventually, everything breaks. And so your species decided, collectively, never to make that mistake again, Threl Vashon said slowly, as if testing the idea for himself. Something like that, Osei said. It's not perfect. We still argue about resources, about risk, about how far is too far. But when someone calls for help, we go. It's not really a calculation anymore. It's just who we are. Threl Vashon considered this in silence for a long moment. I think my council underestimated exactly how deeply that belief runs in your species, he said finally. We assumed you would behave the way most young species behave when threatened. Cautiously, defensively, weighing risk against reward at every step. Instead, you behaved as though the mathematics of risk and reward simply did not apply to you at all. Maybe they don't, Osei said. Not when it comes to something like this. Months later, far from the quiet conference rooms of Fortress Meridian, word of the battle continued to spread through the wider galactic community, carried along diplomatic channels, traders' gossip, and the careful, deliberate briefings of governments trying to decide exactly how seriously to take this strange, stubborn new species that had entered their community. The details shifted slightly with each retelling, as details always do, but the core of the story remained remarkably consistent. A human warship, wounded and alone, had been left for dead by an attacking force that assumed the fight was already over. That ship had sent out a single, desperate call for help, expecting perhaps that no one would arrive in time. And humanity, rather than calculating the odds and deciding the effort was not worth the risk, had answered that call with everything it had, arriving faster and hitting harder than anyone watching believed was possible. It was not, in the end, a story about a great victory or a brilliant strategic masterstroke. It was a much simpler story than that, and perhaps that simplicity was exactly why it spread so far and lingered so long in the minds of those who heard it. It was a story about a species that refused, under any circumstances, to leave its own people behind. Aboard a newly repaired UES Valkyrie, months after the battle that nearly destroyed her, Captain Elena Reyes stood once again on her familiar bridge, watching her rebuilt crew settle back into their stations, preparing for a new assignment along the same dangerous frontier where everything had first gone wrong. Ready to head back out there, Captain? Marcus Cole asked, standing beside her chair. Elena looked out at the stars through the view screen, thinking about everything that had happened since that terrifying night, about the crew she had lost, the crew she had saved, and the strange, unexpected ripples that single desperate SOS had sent across a galaxy that was only just beginning to understand exactly what kind of neighbor humanity intended to be. "Ready," she said finally, settling into her chair with quiet determination. "Let's go see what else is out there." The Valkyrie's engines hummed to life once more, carrying her crew back out into the vast, unpredictable dark, ready, as always, to answer the call whenever it came.